Hey guys, and welcome to another Let's Try to Fix It video. In today's video we're going to be taking a look at this PS4 White. When we turn it on it's got no video, so we just get the blue white, then the white light, but nothing comes up on the screen. So we're just going to plug it in now, just to verify that the issue is correct. So I'll just grab my HDMI cable. And the port doesn't really feel too loose or anything like that. It feels about normal. So we're just going to turn it on now. So far we've got no signal still. It doesn't look like it's detecting anything at all, in fact. So finally transitioned over to the white light, so we should have a signal now. But it looks like the capture card is not picking up anything. And I'm just going to try and wiggle the cable to see if, there's like a loose pin or something, and by doing that we get a signal or any sort of prompt of a signal. But it looks like we're still going to get nothing. So the next step will be to pull it apart and get the board out. Alright, so now with the board out, if we have a look at the pins on this HDMI, it looks like it has been replaced before at some point. But it looks like all those pins aren't maybe connected. We're just going to give it a bit of a wiggle. I can see that some of that flux residue is moving under the pin there, so we may have a bad connection, so we're just going to remove it. So now that port is removed, I'm just going to put some flux over the ground pads and try and de-wick the solder that's there. And I'm just going to add some leaded solder just to make it easier when we have to sort of remove that solder, so that it flows a little bit better. Something I like to do with the braid is just to add a little bit of flux onto the actual braid itself. I find that helps to sort of get the solder flowing through the braid a little bit easier. And it seems to pick it up pretty well. Particularly with like the cheaper Chinese braid. It doesn't seem to be very good, but that extra bit of flux seems to help just flow through the braid. So I'm just going to fast forward while we remove the rest of those solder, and then we can have a look at the other side. Alright, so now on the other side we're just basically going to do the same thing. We're just going to clean up those pads so then we can add some new leaded solder and get a nice strong bonding connection when we put in the new HDMI port. So something to do here is I like to go up and down on those pads as opposed to the other way, because when you go the other way sometimes you can actually rip the pad off, so it's a little less stressful on the pads to go the natural way that they're sort of going, which in this case would be up and down. Alright, so we're just going to now clean that off and spray it with some alcohol, get it nice and clean. and it's come up pretty good so far. Just want to make sure all the junk and grot is out of there so we have a good connection when we apply some leaded solder. Alright, there we go. So now we're just going to add a bit more flux. And then we can add some leaded solder to all of those pads. Now you notice I got a bit of solder on those in that sort of ground pad there, but it's not really a problem. It's the ground pad, and the sort of bottom of the HDMI port's just going to sit on that, so it's not really a big deal. So basically here we're just getting it prepped and ready so that we can put the HDMI port back on there. So something I like to do with the HDMI ports as well is put a little bit of flux on the ground pins, and then just add a dab of solder on each of the ground pins, and that way when you go to put the port down it sort of helps that solder to flow a little bit easier. It's something that I've done for quite a while and it seems to work pretty well, so we don't have to add a huge amount, just sort of enough, or just a little bit, as you'll see here. So there's not much at all, just enough to sort of get it flowing a bit. So again, I'm just adding in some more flux and getting it ready for the heat gun. And we're just going to heat it up now so we can put the port down. So carefully align that port on there. As you can see, it's going on a bit crooked, so just got to straighten it up while the heat's still there. And then press it down. And we're just going to hold it there for the solder to cure. Alright, so let's take a look at how it looks. That's fairly clean so far. I'll just get into view of the camera. So what we want to do now is just check each of those pins are stable. So what we want to do first is just grab the soldering line and go along each of the pins and just solder them down. I usually do it, I count to 3 on sort of each pin, or 2, and that gives us enough time to make sure it's got a good bond to that pad and that solder, so none of those pins are going to be loose. So we just add a little bit of flux to start with. And then we can start going across each of those pins, just 1 or 2 at a time, and just heat them up just to reinforce that bond again. It's a little bit difficult to see, but you sort of know when you've got it right. You'll see a little bit of the solder starts to melt, and then you know you got everything hot enough so it's going to sort of bond. So I use a really small tip for this. The end of the tip actually sort of has like a 45-degree bend on it, and it's 1mm at the end of the tip, so it's really good for this really small pin stuff, because if you use like a bigger tip, it's going to be a lot more difficult to accurately get them all without sort of bridging all the other pins, which is something that you don't want to do. So that's looking pretty good. So now we're just going to go across each of the pins and test them with the tweezers. Just give them a little bit of a nudge to see if they're moving. And if they are moving, then we need to resolder them again. So far it's looking pretty good though. They all seem pretty solid. Alright, so they're all looking pretty good. None of those are moving. So I've just changed my tip and I'm just going across the ground pins for the HDMI port and just adding a little bit of solder on either side just to make sure they've got a nice strong connection. This will help to prevent the port from moving if you wiggle the HDMI cable and stuff like that. So it just adds a little bit of longevity. Bit too much there, so we'll just clean that up. Cool, that side looks alright. So we'll just check the other side as well. So as you can see, there's a few sort of blobs, so we just want to clean that up a little bit. Just get a better view here. So just go along to each of those, heat them up, and just remove any of that excess solder because we don't need that much on there. I'm just going to add a little bit of flux to help with that connection. Help that solder flow a little bit easier. On this side it's not wanting to stick as well. No, that side's looking okay, so we'll just focus on this side now. Just clean that up a little bit. That's looking okay. Just grab that little bit there.
Alright, so now it's time to clean up the board and then we can reassemble it. So just going to clean the old thermal paste off and add new thermal paste. I always recommend doing this. It also adds, that longevity, especially if you're still using the original thermal paste. Alright, so we'll just pop in all the screws, flip it over and put the power supply in. And now we're ready to test it. So just for future reference, if you have issues with the display, you may need to go back in and check all your pins are soldered down correctly. But in this case, we're good to go. We've got the PlayStation logo coming up. And the console should boot in a second. There we go. Another successful repair. Thanks so much for tuning in to watch this video if you got this far. If you liked it, please hit that like button. Don't forget to smash subscribe to stay tuned for future videos like this one. I've got many things planned in the future and would love to see you next time.